Hi again, my name is Oz, and you can find me on Instagram as OzArtist and ArtStation as OzArt. And in this video, I would like to show you how I usually make creepy stuff like this illustration, as well as sharing the things I usually take into account for designing and creating nightmarish creatures. And also a mega tip slash technique I like to use for painting magic lights and effects. Well, let's begin. There is infinity of things in the universe, and also infinite are the things that can cause fear to someone. After all, human beings are a piece of meat, a very complex piece of meat. And even though it may seem difficult to design something that is going to evoke fear, believe me, the only thing you need to know is how to organize some elements. And to make your life easier, I condense all the things that can cause you fear in three small groups. So, the first one is danger. The things that we believe can cause a physical damage to us cause fear, such as certain insects, sharp or pointy things that which our skin is not very resistant, and jaws of some kind of animals. And remember, the pointer the teeth, the better. Second, the unknown. Someone once said that human beings fears the unknown, and everyone agreed with that, so I believe that as well. Anyway, that which our mind cannot understand completely will disturb us. For example, what happens after death and the paranormal things could be scary. Some people are disturbed as well by the darkness, and others are afraid to think about the deep sea or the immensity of outer space. Yes, I'm looking at you, Howard. And lastly, the third group, it might be called things out of context. Everything has a primary function. That is the thing that pops in your mind as soon as we think about it. But if we put that object out of its comfort zone and placed it somewhere else, into another thing, some other weird and disturbing stuff might start to happen. The Japanese people know how to do this very well. For example, some yokais use this concept wonderfully. For the other example, we're gonna make a little experiment. Close your eyes and think about a little kitty. Many people will think it's adorable, right? Well, what would happen if we replace its fluffy little paws with 10 insect legs? I think not so many people will find this cat cute anymore. And for more example like this, I recommend studying the work of the Japanese mangaka artist called Junji Ito. He's a master using all these concepts I told you about before. And with this in mind, finally we can start design our creature. In this case, I prefer to scroll some lines first, some masses with a lot of legs here, lots of fangs and eyes there. Anyway, a lot of things out of context, and in the end up with these 5 designs. What I did after is something that I also always recommend doing to all artists around the world, and that is asking friends and or family. In this case, the winner for the spookiest design was the number 4. So I took that design, and as always I usually do, I made some thumbnails in 2 inks, black and white, looking for an interesting composition and narrative. And after another round of votes, the winner was the thumbnail number 3. But the number 2 was pretty close, so I developed the thumbnail a little bit more by adding some intermediate values and try to mix those 2 thumbnails and end up with this. After that, I grabbed the thumbnail and turned down the opacity and began to make a better sketch defining elements of the creature. In this stage, I decided that the small character will serve as a guide for the colossal monster that is behind it, because the monster can also have friends. Finishing the sketch, I began to look for a color palette that could represent the oppressive mood of a place where you don't want to be. And for that, the first thing you should do is looking for some reference. Enter the wonderful internet and look for photos and pictures that can transmit those emotions that only you can find. With those references, take the sketch and copy it several times and color it with layers with multiply, overlay, and for the purposes of lighting and effects, I like to use add glow. And when the color thumbnails were finished, I asked my friends again, and the winner in this time is the number 2, and some liked the number 3 as well. So I again did a mix between those two options. With the final color tone, I can start painting. I changed the color lines to a more saturated green color and began defining the volume of the forms in a normal layer above everything. In order for this to go well, first you have to know how to paint the basic figures from any angle with any lighting. Although in this particular case, the figure that prevails in the composition is the cylinder and maybe the sphere. So I brought back a few explanatory figures to show you what I have in mind when I start to define the volumes of these two figures. I personally like to start with the figure's silhouette and then add a basic shadow in which I define the direction of the light. Then I soften a little bit the edges of this shadow, and after that, and according to the color tone, there are some secondary lights here and there. So taking into account where the light comes, I can define where the light hits and where the shadows project by the objects, which are always opposed to the lights. Then I add the occlusion shadow, which remember are the darkest shadow that are between two surfaces meet. Some highlights here and there, and this is the way I define the volume of the objects in this painting. Back to the illustration, before anything else I merged the entire image in another layer and made some cuts so the elements of the illustration had their own layer. Doing this is easier for me to paint them later. With this ready, and although it's something intimidating at first to see so many shapes here and there, what do you need to do is first think where is the biggest and more general shapes and start to paint those. Then follow with the medium ones, and at the end the smaller ones, what we typically call the details. In this one I decide to erase the secondary lights to focus on the main light first. With the volumes a little better defined and take into account where the light comes, I paint the shadows that this source of light will create. After designing the smaller and concrete shapes, I add the secondary light. And here we comes with the mega tip I told you in the beginning of the video. So, follow the next steps. 1. Create a layer and fill it with a black color. 2. Create an empty layer and clip it to the layer below, in this case the black layer. 3. Go to a layer tab, new correction layer, and then select gradient map. Click OK and clip it to the black layer as well. 4. Go to the black layer and change it from normal to lighten. You can group all these layers in a new folder, but this is important, you must change the normal folder to through. With this setup arranged, we double click on the gradient map layer and we can choose the colors of the gradient map, but always taking into account that the left end is black and the right one is white. At the middle, you can create any succession of colors that you like or need. Then, in the empty layer that we clipped to the black layer before, we can begin to paint in grayscale. We don't need to use colors because the gradient map above will interpret the values of the grayscale, and it will associate them to a color of the association of colors we create in the gradient map. So if we start painting with a brush that has opacity sensibility, using just pure white can generate these effects, and if at the end you don't like the result, it doesn't matter. You can go back to the layer tab, new correction layer, and instead of gradient map, we're gonna choose now the hue, saturation, luminosity layer to modify the colors without having to create a new gradient map. With this powerful tool, we can begin to define the lights that the monster has in the arms and the flame of the little girl. I end with the lights and decide to detail a little more the floor, creating some doodles that look like forest herbs or grass, and then copy and paste several times to create details and texture on the ground quickly, and add some highlights and shadows to the new plants on the setting to integrate them with the illustration. At the end, the girl didn't convince me that much, so I erase her and use the same technique to create a ghost girl that will be the new friend of our monster. Now, with his new friend, I decide to detail the image a little bit more, and later I ask for the last time some friends their opinion. Thanks to their tips and opinions and feedback, I gave the ultimate touch to the image, creating a denser atmosphere to evidence the size of the monster a bit easily. Also, I add some elements to the foreground to emphasize the depth of the illustration and decrease the intensity of the light that comes out of the monster's shoulders, so that doesn't steal that much attention. I detail a little more here and there, and finally, with the help of more layers of correction, in this case level correction and color balance, I turned up the contrast a little more and brought back some those magenta tone that I liked from the original thumbnail. And here is it. I hope you like this tutorial and I hope you learned something. But what I really want you to remember from this tutorial is, every time you go to paint your nightmares, never forget to annoy your friends or family with questions about your illustration. That's it. Gracias for watching. Bye.